My name is Sarah. I used to be the daughter who stayed close, who never missed a birthday, who answered every call at 3 a.m. when Dad's chest hurt or Mom couldn't find her pills. I was the one who cleaned out gutters, who drove them to appointments, who held their hands in hospital waiting rooms while my brother lived his life 3 states away, chasing dreams that never quite materialized. I always knew I wasn't the favorite. That knowledge settled into my bones early, the way chronic pain becomes part of your daily rhythm. My brother Marcus had this magnetic pull, charming, ambitious, always on the verge of something big. He'd sweep into family gatherings with stories of new ventures, new opportunities, new reasons why he needed just a little more help to make it all work. They'd light up when he walked in, their faces transforming in ways I never quite managed to inspire. But I stayed. Through Dad's heart surgery when Marcus couldn't get time off work. Through Mom's broken hip when Marcus was launching his 3rd failed startup. Through the long, quiet afternoons when they felt forgotten by the world. I was there. Making tea, organizing pillboxes, listening to the same stories they'd told me 100 times before. The shift started so gradually I almost missed it. Phone calls that used to be returned within hours began stretching into days. When I'd ask about their plans, about the house, about what would happen to Grandpa's land someday, their answers became vague, evasive. Mom, who used to share every detail of her day, began speaking in careful, measured phrases that said nothing at all. "We're handling things," she'd say when I asked about their estate planning. "Everything's taken care of." Dad, who had always been direct, almost blunt in his honesty, started avoiding my eyes. Conversations that used to flow naturally became stilted, formal. When I'd visit, he'd busy himself with projects, disappearing into his workshop, or suddenly remembering urgent errands that couldn't wait. The house itself began to feel different. Photo arrangements shifted. Pictures of Marcus moved to more prominent positions, while mine seemed to migrate to darker corners, behind other frames, sometimes disappearing altogether. Small things, but in a family, small things carry the weight of entire conversations, never spoken aloud. Before we continue, drop a comment. Where are you watching this from, and what time is it there? I'd love to know how far this story is reaching. Sometimes when we're sitting alone with our pain, it helps to know we're not the only ones awake in the dark, wondering how the people who were supposed to love us most could make us feel so invisible. The final blow came wrapped in casual conversation over coffee with Janet, a family friend who'd known us since I was small. We were catching up, talking about nothing particularly important, when she mentioned something that stopped my heart, mid-beat. "So you're okay with everything going to Marcus?" she asked, stirring sugar into her coffee with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. The coffee shop seemed to tilt. The familiar sounds, conversations, clinking cups, the hiss of the espresso machine, faded into a distant hum. I felt the floor disappear beneath me, that sickening sensation of free fall when you realize the ground you thought was solid never existed at all. "What do you mean?" I managed to ask, though my voice sounded foreign to my own ears. Janet's face changed immediately. The casual friendliness drained away, replaced by the horrified realization of someone who'd just delivered news they never intended to share. "Oh, honey," she whispered. "Oh no, you didn't know." I didn't know. After 35 years of being their daughter, of being present, of being dependable, I didn't know that they'd changed their will. I didn't know that while I was bringing them groceries and organizing their medications, they were meeting with lawyers, signing papers, erasing my name from their legacy like I was a typo to be corrected. The ride home passed in a blur. I sat in my car in their driveway for 20 minutes, staring at the house I'd helped maintain, the garden I'd planted, the front steps I'd repaired last spring when they were too frail to manage it themselves. Everything looked the same. But something fundamental had shifted, like discovering the walls of your childhood home were made of paper instead of brick. When I finally walked inside, they were watching television. The same evening routine they'd followed for years. Mom looked up with her usual smile, but I caught the flicker of something else in her eyes. Guilt, maybe, or fear that the secret they'd been carrying had finally found its way to daylight. "We need to talk," I said quietly. The silence that followed felt endless. Dad reached for the remote and clicked off the television. Mom's hands folded in her lap, her knuckles white against the fabric of her dress. In that moment, I saw them clearly. Not as my parents, but as two people who had made a choice and were now facing the consequences. "You changed the will," I said. It wasn't a question. Dad cleared his throat, a sound I'd heard 1,000 times before, but never quite like this. "Sarah," without telling me. Mom's voice was barely above a whisper. "He needs it more." 4 words. 4 words that summarized 35 years of my relationship with my parents, that reduced every sacrifice I'd made, every moment I'd chosen them over my own convenience, to a simple calculation of need versus worth. "He needs it more," I repeated, tasting the bitterness of it. When I was 25 and couldn't make rent, when I had to choose between groceries and car payments, when I called you crying because I didn't know how I was going to manage, did I need it then? They didn't answer. What could they say? We all remembered those conversations, those nights when I'd swallowed my pride and asked for help, only to be told that money was tight, that they couldn't spare much, that I needed to learn to stand on my own feet. Meanwhile, Marcus received check after check for business ventures that never materialized, startup costs for companies that never started, investment money for opportunities that somehow always disappeared. "He's trying to build something," Dad said finally, his voice defensive in the way it always was when Marcus's failures needed explaining. "And what am I building?" I asked. "What have I been building here with you for all these years?" The question hung in the air between us. Outside, I could hear the neighbor's dog barking, the distant sound of traffic, the ordinary sounds of a world continuing to turn, while mine stopped completely. That night, I drove home through streets that looked familiar, but felt foreign, like scenery from someone else's life. I sat in my apartment, the small, modest apartment I'd chosen partly because it was close to them, partly because helping them with their needs meant I never quite managed to save enough for something better. And listened to the sound of my own heartbeat in the silence. The betrayal was complete. But what hurt most wasn't the money or the property. It was the realization that they had been planning my erasure, discussing my removal from their future, making decisions about their legacy while I sat in their kitchen, making grocery lists and organizing their pill dispensers. I had become invisible to the people who were supposed to see me most clearly. The weeks that followed passed in a strange, muffled quiet. I stopped calling. For the first time in years, I didn't check in daily, didn't ask about doctor appointments or prescription refills, didn't volunteer for household repairs or grocery runs. The silence felt foreign at first, like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit, but gradually it began to feel like something else, like space, like breathing room, like the first tentative steps toward reclaiming myself. They didn't call either. The phone that used to ring constantly with their requests, their questions, their casual conversations, remained silent. I wondered if they were relieved to be free of my attention, or if they were finally feeling the absence of care they'd taken for granted for so long. At work, colleagues began to comment that I seemed different, more focused, more present. I realized I'd been carrying the weight of their needs, their expectations, their quiet disappointment in me for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to move through the world without that constant pressure on my shoulders. I started taking evening walks, something I'd never had time for when my evenings were filled with their phone calls and visits. The neighborhood looked different from this perspective, more detailed, more alive. I noticed gardens I'd walked past for years without seeing, architectural details that had been invisible when I was always rushing from one obligation to another, One evening, about 6 weeks after our confrontation, I found myself standing in front of the old law office downtown, the same building where Grandpa had handled his legal affairs for decades. I hadn't planned to go there. My feet had simply carried me in that direction during my walk. The brass nameplate still read Coleman and Associates, though Mr. Coleman himself had passed away years ago. His son had taken over the practice, maintaining the same old-fashioned dignity that had made his father my grandfather's trusted advisor. Something made me push open the door. The waiting room smelled like leather and old paper, exactly as I remembered from childhood visits with Grandpa. The receptionist, a woman probably in her 60s with kind eyes and silver hair, looked up with the sort of genuine smile that had become rare in my recent experience. "Can I help you?" "I'm Sarah Mitchell," I said. My grandfather was Thomas Mitchell. He used to— "Oh my goodness, yes!" Her face brightened with recognition. "Your grandfather was such a wonderful man. Mr. Coleman, the younger Mr. Coleman, he still talks about him. How can we help you?" I explained my situation as simply as I could, watching her expression shift from pleasant attention to serious concern. When I finished, she nodded thoughtfully. "Let me see if Mr. Coleman has a few minutes. I think he'd want to speak with you about this." Robert Coleman was younger than I'd expected, maybe 50, with his father's gentle manner and sharp eyes. He listened to my story without interruption, occasionally making notes on a yellow legal pad, his expression growing more serious as I continued. "Your grandfather was very thorough in his documentation," he said finally, very concerned that his wishes be carried out exactly as he intended. "Tell me, do you have any of his papers?" I thought about the boxes in my closet, the files I'd inherited when Grandpa died, documents I'd kept more out of sentiment than practicality. "Some things," I said. "Letters, certificates, old business papers." "Would you mind bringing them in? Sometimes people don't realize what they have. Your grandfather was particular about legal matters. He believed in backup documentation, multiple copies of important papers. That weekend, I spread everything across my dining room table. Boxes I hadn't opened in years yielded their contents: faded photographs, letters written in Grandpa's careful script, business documents from his small construction company, certificates, and deeds and contracts. At the bottom of the third box, tucked inside a manila envelope that had yellowed with age, I found it. The will was written in Grandpa's handwriting, each letter formed with the precision of someone who understood that words on paper could outlive the person who wrote them. My hands trembled as I read the familiar legal language, the careful distribution of assets, the specific bequests to family members. And there, in black ink that had remained clear despite the passing years, was my name. Not just mentioned in passing, but named as the primary beneficiary of the house, the land, everything that had been built by his hands and passed down through generations of our family. The document was dated, signed, and witnessed by two people whose signatures were notarized at the bottom of the page. I read it 3 times before the reality settled in. This wasn't a draft or an early version that had been superseded by later changes. This was a complete, legal document that predated anything my parents might have created by several years. More importantly, it had never been revoked. Monday morning found me back in Mr. Coleman's office, the will carefully preserved, in a protective folder. His reaction was immediate and telling. His eyebrows rose slightly as he examined the document, his expression shifting from professional interest to something approaching satisfaction. "This is extraordinary," he said after several minutes of careful examination, not just because it exists, but because of how it was executed. Your grandfather really did know what he was doing. He explained the legal intricacies in terms I could understand. Grandpa's will had been properly witnessed, notarized, and filed with the appropriate offices. Most importantly, it had never been legally revoked or superseded, Any changes my parents had made to their own estate plans couldn't override the specific bequests Grandpa had made regarding property that was still technically part of his estate. Your parents may have assumed that property had become theirs, outright, Mr. Coleman explained. But the way your grandfather structured things, certain assets were held in a kind of generational trust. They had the right to live there, to maintain the property, but the ultimate ownership was always intended to pass according to his original wishes. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal procedures, document filings, and quiet preparation. Mr. Coleman handled everything with the same methodical care his father had shown my grandfather, keeping me informed of each step while managing the complex legal machinery that would restore what had been intended all along. I didn't tell my parents what was happening. For the first time in my adult life, I kept something important to myself, held my own counsel, made decisions without seeking their approval or input. The silence felt powerful in a way I hadn't expected. Not the silence of exclusion I'd experienced from them, but the silence of someone who finally understood her own worth. During those weeks, I began to see my relationship with my parents differently. The patterns that had seemed like natural family dynamics revealed themselves as something else entirely, a systematic devaluation of my contributions, a careful cultivation of my dependence on their approval, a quiet campaign to make me grateful for scraps while my brother received full portions. I thought about all the times I'd apologized for needing help, all the occasions when I'd minimized my own achievements to avoid seeming boastful or demanding. I remembered conversations where my successes were quickly redirected to discussions of Marcus's potential, where my problems were treated as character flaws, while his were viewed as temporary setbacks requiring family support. The realization was both liberating and heartbreaking. I mourned the daughter I had been, eager to please, constantly seeking validation, willing to shrink myself to fit into the small space they'd allocated for me in their affections. But I also began to glimpse the woman I might become. Someone who understood her own value, who didn't need others to define her worth, who could stand in her own space without apology. 3 months after that conversation in their living room, the official notice arrived at their house. I wasn't there when they received it, but I imagined the scene. Mom sorting through the mail with her usual efficiency, pausing when she saw the legal return address, calling Dad over to examine the thick envelope that would change everything they thought they knew about their future. The letter was formal, professionally worded, but its message was unmistakable. The property they had assumed was theirs to dispose of had never legally belonged to them. The will they had changed could not override the earlier document that had established different intentions. The house, the land, the legacy they had planned to give exclusively to Marcus would be distributed according to Grandpa's original wishes. They called that evening. The phone rang while I was making dinner, the same time they usually called during the years when we spoke regularly. I looked at the caller ID and let it ring. Then I turned off the ringer and finished cooking my meal, in peace. The voicemail they left was strange. Dad's voice, formal and strained, asking me to call them back, saying they needed to discuss some legal matters. No apology, no acknowledgement of what they had done, just the practical concern of people who had discovered their plans had been derailed by circumstances beyond their control. I didn't call back that night, or the next day, or the day after that. For weeks, the phone rang at regular intervals, but I had learned something valuable about the power of silence, about the strength that comes from refusing to be drawn back into patterns that had never served me well. When I finally did return their call, it was on my terms, at my timing, with my own agenda firmly in place. Mom answered on the first ring, her voice carrying a breathless quality that suggested she'd been waiting anxiously for this moment. "Sarah, honey, we need to talk about this legal situation." "No," I said quietly. "We don't." The simplicity of that response seemed to catch her off guard. In all our years of complicated family dynamics, I had never refused to engage, never declined to help them solve their problems, or work through their concerns. But the lawyer says, I know what the lawyer says. I'm the one who found Grandpa's will. The silence that followed was different from the awkward pauses that had marked our recent interactions. This was the silence of people realizing that someone they had underestimated had been several steps ahead of them all along. You knew? Dad's voice came from the background, apparently close enough to the phone to hear our conversation. I found it after you decided I didn't need to know about your changes. Turns out Grandpa was very specific about his intentions, and very careful about his documentation. What followed was a conversation unlike any we'd ever had. For the first time in my adult life, I was the one with power, with knowledge, with the ability to determine the outcome of a family situation. They tried various approaches: guilt, anger, bargaining, appeals to family loyalty. I listened to each attempt with the detached interest of someone watching a performance she had once been part of, but could now observe from the outside. We only wanted what was best for the family, Mom said finally, her voice small and uncertain. You wanted what was best for Marcus, I corrected. That's not the same thing. In the end, there was nothing they could do. The legal processes had already been set in motion. The proper authorities had been notified, and the property would be transferred according to Grandpa's original intentions. The house I had helped maintain, the land I had cared for, the legacy I had thought was lost forever. All of it would come to me, as it had always been intended to. Marcus called a few weeks later, his voice carrying a mixture of anger and bewilderment that I found almost amusing. He'd driven down from his current city to assess the situation, to see if there was some angle he'd missed, some way to challenge what was happening. This isn't fair, he said, jumping straight to the heart of his complaint, without bothering with pleasantries. They promised me that house. They promised you something that was never theirs to give, I replied. But I'm the one with the business. Ideas, the plans for the property. You don't even need it. There it was, the assumption that had driven our family dynamics for decades. Marcus needed things more than I did, deserved things more than I did, could make better use of opportunities than I could. The fact that I had spent years caring for our parents, maintaining the property, preserving the family connections meant nothing compared to his theoretical potential. You're right, I said, surprising him with my agreement. I don't need it the same way you do. I never expected other people to solve my problems or fund my dreams. I learned to build my own life instead of waiting for someone else to give me one. The conversation ended shortly after that. He had no response to the truth, no argument that could counter the reality of someone who had finally stopped accepting less than she deserved. 6 months later, I was sitting on the front porch of my house, not my parents' house, not the family house, but my house, watching the sun set through the oak trees Grandpa had planted 50 years ago. The legal processes had been completed, the property transferred, the inheritance settled according to its original intentions. My parents had moved to a smaller place across town, a tidy apartment that better suited their actual financial situation, without the inflated expectations of windfall property sales. We spoke occasionally, carefully polite conversations that acknowledged our blood relationship while maintaining the emotional distance that had become necessary for my peace of mind. Marcus had returned to his distant city and his ongoing series of almost successful ventures. I heard updates occasionally through family friends. Another business idea, another partnership, another opportunity that would surely be the one to finally pay off. I wished him well from a distance, the same way I might wish well for any acquaintance whose struggles didn't require my personal investment. The house itself had settled around me like a familiar embrace. I'd painted the rooms, updated the fixtures, and brought life back to spaces that had grown tired during the years when they'd been maintained, but not truly lived in. The garden flourished under my attention, producing vegetables and flowers that I tended with the same patience Grandpa had shown me as a child. But the most profound change wasn't in the property or the legal ownership. It was in the way I moved through the world, no longer carrying the weight of other people's expectations. no longer shrinking myself to fit into spaces that had been designed to diminish me. I had learned to trust my own judgment, to value my own contributions, to expect the same respect from others that I had finally learned to give myself. Sometimes, in the evening quiet, I thought about the daughter I used to be, desperate for approval, willing to accept crumbs of affection, grateful for whatever small portion of love might be offered. I felt compassion for her, understanding. Now how thoroughly she had been trained to undervalue herself, how carefully she had been taught that her needs mattered less than everyone else's comfort. But I didn't mourn her disappearance. She had served her purpose, surviving a family system that had no space for her authentic self, keeping me alive and functional until I was strong enough to become someone else. Someone who understood that love shouldn't require the erasure of your own worth, that family bonds built on inequality and diminishment aren't bonds worth preserving.